is Christy Schiller. She has her Master's of Arts. She's the VP of Religious Services at Presidium. She's been with Presidium since 2004 and oversees their work with faith-based organizations and their insured. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy right now, and we really appreciate her expertise on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, and I appreciate your time. I know this is a busy time of year for most churches, most congregations, and so I'm going to try to get through the material rather quickly, but as Mary said, feel free to type in questions, and this will be recorded, and I will leave my contact information with you guys so you can follow up with me as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, our topic today is 5 things churches can do to protect youth. A little bit about who Presidium is. You can probably tell from my accent, we're based in Texas. We're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we've been working with youth-serving organizations for over 25 years. Our work is really to help you protect those in your care from abuse and to help preserve trust in your organization. And so this is really our exclusive focus, and it really works out nicely when we're able to partner with an organization like Insurance Board to help deliver on that. And so we work with thousands of clients across the full spectrum of child-serving organizations, YMCAs, churches, and really the full spectrum. Anyone who serves children or vulnerable populations runs this risk. So we have worked to help develop specific operational standards that any organization that works with youth can utilize to improve their risk management efforts. So just moving along here. What we have found over 25 years in research and reviewing case after case of incidences of abuse, abuse is not a natural disaster. A timely way to think about this, considering everything that we've been seeing in our country the last few weeks. But there are warning signs that we can recognize now that we really didn't have the knowledge of not so long ago. And so what we want to help your congregations do is empower you with what those warning signs are so that you can recognize those signs earlier rather than after the fact. And so with that, we believe abuse is preventable. For years, the conversation was about what to do when it happens. We're really at the point now, as a science for abuse risk management, of talking about how we prevent, which is really exciting. And so the way that we approach this at Presidium is through what we call the safety equation. And if you'll just hang with me a few minutes, I promise not to get too technical, but effectively when we first got started 25 years ago, our founder was on the board of a local YMCA that had, unfortunately, a terrible incident in one of their after-school programs. And so as you can imagine, their entire mission is to have a safe place for kids to be, and they were devastated. So they appealed to him as an academic, as a clinical psychologist who's worked with victims and with offenders, and said, Dr. Dangle, how can we make sure this never happens again? And so he got a group of graduate students together, and they started doing research on, what are the patterns? What are the ways that organizations are vulnerable to these sorts of incidents? And what they found was there wasn't that one thing that each organization had. I think a lot of folks were under the impression that, it was just a really skilled, manipulative person who infiltrated the organization and, was able to do this without anyone noticing. And what we found was that was just not the case. There were a lot of reasons. There were a lot of missed opportunities, if you will, that, of course, we're only able to get through the benefit of hindsight. And so these risks, these exposures, if you will, really clustered into 8 areas. And that's, when we look at the safety equation, you'll see those 8 areas. And so we want to work with congregations and other youth-serving organizations to to bolster their efforts in each of these areas to minimize the opportunity for someone to act out with a child. And so it's really a systems approach. And so what we're going to talk about today kind of echoes about these different areas, and I'll just walk through those, and again, be happy to field questions. Okay, this may be a recap for some of you, but I think by now most people are aware of really the scale and the scope of the problem of child sexual abuse in our country. We know that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 7 boys will experience sexual abuse before they turn 18, and that's pretty sobering, and we certainly don't want this to happen in one of your youth programs. There are also a lot of studies out there that show that 10% of school children in public schools have experienced abuse at the hands of an educator or a volunteer. Another important piece to keep in mind in all of this, and something I don't think we talk about enough, is the fact that almost half of the incidents of abuse that occur are committed by juveniles. And that's really a dynamic that we're starting to learn more about. I can tell you anecdotally at Presidium, these are the sorts of calls we get almost every day. Organizations really not knowing how to deal with that, and you know, really trying to get a handle on how does this happen. It's really not on their radar. So this is an area that we definitely want to start talking more about because the risk is very real. We also know that the overwhelming majority of cases don't get reported. And so it's important that we create an environment in your church that makes it possible to encourage young people to come forward so they can start getting some help and start healing. Just a little on the effects of abuse on victims and kind of getting back to the why in all of this. Why do we do all of this? We know that a child who's experienced abuse can have lifelong symptoms, can have lifelong challenges, be they psychological. We see depression and anxiety, challenges trusting. We see drop in grades. We see behavioral issues like acting out, challenges with interpersonal relationships, and again, getting back to that issue of trust, and sexual issues as well, whether it be acting out or really just challenges with intimacy, given the experience that they've had. And so, again, you know, what I'm about to describe is going to sound like a lot of work, but gosh, if we can prevent one child from experiencing this, it's absolutely worth it. So specifically when we look at churches, you know, we see when there have been incidents of sexual abuse, it can really threaten the mission. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here on this, but, you know, when we have to focus on this really painful thing that has a rippling effect throughout the congregation, be it the individual who was abused, their family, their friends, you know, we see people leave congregations over these things. And so we see awards of up to from $3,000 to multi-million-dollar settlements, and I think most churches just can't take on that sort of financial. Yes, ma'am.
It's Mary.
Yes.
Somebody just typed in that the slides are not forwarding.
Oh no. Okay. Well, they are on my end. I'm not sure how to.
They are too. Everybody else, could you type in if anybody can see the slides? It should be on effects of abuse on churches. Okay, somebody says, okay, they say they can see them. I'm not sure. Okay, they're working fine, I guess. So it must be a technical issue with somebody's. Okay, keep going. I apologize.
I did that the software, when I logged in, it suggested that you use Chrome or Firefox for the best optimization. So for that person, if you're on a different browser, that might be giving you some challenges.
Thank you.
Okay. And for that person, please know you will get the slide deck and have access to this afterward. We also know that plaintiffs prevail in 2/3 of these cases, and it can jeopardize your insurability. And really, the reputational damage can be incalculable. Unfortunately, we've seen churches who are known as that church where that happened, and it takes a long time for that to shake. So again, that's more context on the why. We also know that churches can be particularly vulnerable because of the close relationships, which is, ironic and tragic all at the same time, but we know individuals may prey upon that. And churches are trusting environments. They're places of redemption, and they're places of forgiveness. And, I don't think most people in the congregation are coming to church, with this at the front of mind. And that's not necessarily what I'm advocating, but it's a place where it's home. And so that can create some challenges. For example, the high level of access that anyone at church has to youth. There was a time not long ago that if you were a living, breathing person who was willing to volunteer at church, church would love to have you. And so we've learned to be a little more selective about who we're going to give access to youth. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the screening was really not part of the culture of most churches not so long ago. Churches, have also struggled with supervision, and so we're talking about particularly of youth programs. It's kind of the youth minister, maybe a parent or two helping out, but, there are always opportunities for someone to be alone with a child in the context of pastoral ministry or something like that, and so we just got to really be more intentional about how we approach those sorts of interactions. Churches serve vulnerable populations. There are people who are not just sort of traditionally vulnerable in the sense that they're young or older, but just people who are hurting, people who are in need of pastoral support, people who've experienced grief or divorce. So that's a vulnerability as well. And the environment has power over children and adults, and so there's that reverence, and in some cases there's a hierarchy there that individuals are deferential to, and that can create some barriers, particularly when we look at things like reporting. Okay, so briefly, there are 3 types of offenders that we typically see in youth-serving organizations. The first is what we would call a preferential offender, and this is probably the type of offender that most folks think of at this point in history, but this is someone who is really a predator, someone who is going to really have an MO for how they approach getting access. They groom children. They may have multiple victims, and this is a pretty scary type of offender. But the good news about this type of offender is they give a lot of warning signs, and a lot of parents, a lot of folks who work with young people are getting more and more savvy about recognizing what we might call the grooming pattern. In my experience, the more likely scenario in a church, now again, this is purely anecdotal, I don't have data on it, but in 14 years, most of the cases I've seen in churches are more what we would call a situational offender. And this is someone who's not necessarily a predator. They might not come into a ministry with the intent of abusing a youth, but this is someone who just might lack some maturity. They may have some struggles in their life that they're not coping with well, and they may act out with a youth out of a matter of convenience, or they may feel like they have a special connection. They relate more to their youth than their peers, and so this is a kind of situation that spirals out of control. So it's a different dynamic, and I wanted to highlight because, again, just in my experience, that's the more typical pattern that we tend to see in churches. Not that the first one doesn't happen, because it does, but we see more female offenders in this type of situational profile. You've probably seen case after case in the news about, young teachers who fall in love with their student. And there may not even be a huge age difference, but these situations can be just as impactful. The third type of offender is what we would call an indiscriminate offender, and this is kind of the classic dangerous stranger. And mercifully, this is a very rare type of offender. It's less than 10% of cases, but this type of offender, they're actually more sexually aroused by the pain and suffering than by the sexual contact itself. So this is someone who would abduct a child, who would physically harm a child. And so luckily that's very rare. Anyone who's over the age of 40, this is probably who they were told to fear as children. So we still need to be aware of it, but really the more likely scenarios are number one and particularly number two. Really what any offender needs, whether they're predatory or if it's more sort of circumstantial or opportunistic, they need three things. Access to children. So, how do they actually get access to children, whether it be volunteering or just helping out, chaperoning. It's probably not real hard to get access in a church because of the way that churches operate, and that's fine. But the other two pieces, require a little more effort. So one of those is privacy. Privacy is simply getting a child alone, and this type of abuse requires privacy. And so I think you'll see here in a bit, a lot of what we recommend is around keeping those interactions public and not allowing anyone to be alone with a child, whether it be alone somewhere in the church. More likely scenario is getting a child off campus, so hanging out with a child after youth group, getting a child alone at camp. There are other opportunities to get a child alone, and so we want to really be mindful for the safety of your staff and volunteers too, not to be alone with a child. And then the third piece is control, and that's really the manipulation and some of the grooming. And this really isn't just for the child. A lot of that extends to the child's family or even the church community. So we call that community grooming, really sort of creating this image of a great person that no one would ever believe would do something like this. Time after time, those cases are so scandalous because no one thought that this person was capable of that. And a lot of times they've been very intentional about creating that myth about themselves. So when we talk about red flags, we want to think about these behaviors that could indicate someone trying to get privacy or control. So let's get into the 5 steps like I promised. The first one is having policies and really setting the bar for what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So defining those boundaries. And, most healthy adults have a good sense of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But folks who haven't had any training in this area may be sloppier than they realize about sort of where that standard is now. And so, by defining those boundaries, you're defining a norm, and that makes it easier for folks to see what's outside of that norm. So it's creating what we would call a bandwidth of acceptable behavior, and that's really important. Otherwise, you're leaving your staff and volunteers to kind of discern and rationalize, well, that kind of made me feel weird, but it's not, that person, their cultural heritage is very affectionate, so that's just how they are, and they move on. Where in reality that could be a red flag that person is grooming or forming an inappropriate relationship with a child. Policies also help create institutional memory. So that's really sort of codifying what the expectations are, and it's important to communicate these policies effectively, not just hand them out and know that no one's ever going to look at them again, but to really educate folks on what those policies are and why they're there. Sometimes it doesn't feel natural when churches have been operating the same way for 30, 40 years, and it kind of feels like this is being put upon folks, and there's really so much reasoning behind what these policies are. Step two is having a screening process designed to screen out offenders. And so, as I mentioned, certain types of offenders you're going to see in their history. One, they may have something in a criminal background check, but we can't rely on that alone, and I'll get into that in a bit. But you may see patterns of just someone who spends all of their time with kids, and some people do that very genuinely. But looking for someone who also has peer relationships, that they have healthy adult relationships as well. Background checks are something that churches are definitely doing more and more, and really that's kind of a 101 step of what you need to do. It's really essential for due diligence, but given the notion that a background check implies you're going to catch something if they've been caught, we can't rely on those 100%. And I think it's tempting to put all of our eggs in that basket, but really and truly it's not the best way. You have to do it because of due diligence, and if you haven't done it and there's an incident, it's going to be really painful. So do background checks, but don't put all your eggs in that basket. A good screening process will also encourage applicants to self-select out. It sends a message to say, wow, this church really takes this seriously, and it's going to be hard for me to do what I want to do here. So I've decided I'm not going to volunteer after all. So that's okay. That's okay. That's kind of what we want. The other thing that we're trying to do in screening is get a handle on behaviors and understand the behavioral patterns, because that's where we're going to get the best information. So whether that be through references, interview questions, we're really trying to create a behavioral profile of this individual to try to determine how they're going to be with youth. So we have a lot of behavioral psychologists at Presidium, and we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So really asking those behaviorally based questions that they don't ask, what would you do if, right? Because if you ask it theoretically, people are going to answer exactly like you think, they think you want them to. But when you ask that question from a behavioral perspective, we say, tell me about a time when you had a youth who was really, really, had a lot of behavioral problems. How did you handle that? And seeing how they handled it in the past is going to help better predict how they would handle that in the future. I did see one question come across about the frequency of background checks. I can tell you, really, the national standard that we're seeing is every 2 years. That is what nationally the YMCA and the Boys and Girls Clubs are doing, and we're seeing that with a number of large hierarchical churches in the U.S. too. So, again, there's a range. Some churches do it every year, some do it every 5, but we're really seeing 2 become the norm. All right. Step 3. Provide training with compliance tracking. And so this is not just saying, here are some resources we suggest. This is saying we require this training and providing the right content that's talking about prevention, not reaction. Content that is going to be really practical and specific to their ministry. So if you have a camp, okay, what do we need to know about camps and where does abuse tend to happen in camps? If you have a school, same thing. Ideally, it will be easy access and use, and target sort of a blended learning approach. So some online training, but also some follow-up and making sure that people got what they were supposed to get out of that training. And ideally, again, it would be something that's easy to verify that folks have completed that training. And in a bit, I'll share with you some of the resources that are available to you through the insurance board that we have created that will tick all of these boxes. Step 4, and I'll just shamelessly say I think this is the most important step, is supervision, because you can have the best policies, the best training, the best screening, but this is really where the rubber meets the road. when folks are empowered to know what the warning signs are, how do they really see those in play? So really communicating to your staff why we do this, and that's obviously our first and foremost is for the safety of youth, but also for their safety as well. I would hope that if I was being sloppy with boundaries, one of my colleagues would say something to me, and in a very fraternal way, but I would want to make sure that I change that behavior. So we want them to truly be empowered to do that. Really kind of getting into the weeds here on managing high-risk situations. So we have kids that need to go to the bathroom. What is our bathroom protocol? How can we make sure that there aren't two kids alone in the bathroom, where we typically see the most what we would call peer-to-peer incidents of abuse? Don't be predictable. So you want to have some formal supervision, but as church leaders, drop in from time to time. Make sure everybody knows it's possible that church leadership could drop in and just kind of see how things are going. And what you're really monitoring for are exceptions. So policy violations, lots of people who were just making bad choices about their boundaries. And this is really not so much in an effort to say gotcha, but an effort to say, wow, we need to fix this. And so that might indicate more training is needed. It might mean we need to clarify a policy. It's really there to help ensure that all of these great things that you've developed are truly being implemented on the ground level. And step 5, this is implementing systems for reporting and responding. And there are kind of two ends of the spectrum here. One is responding to red flag behaviors, boundary violations, policy violations. That's different than if you suspect abuse. So many of you have probably had training by now on what your obligations are as a mandated reporter in your state. So that's kind of the far end of the spectrum, but really letting people know if you have a concern, here's who we want you to speak to about that. And really minimizing any of the barriers that might be there, and maybe even giving folks options. So we want to respond to tremors, not earthquakes. That's ideal. And treat these tremors as near misses, free lessons. That's how we learn and we grow. We see a weakness in the system, and we want to help bolster that. Not responding in isolation, and of course, removing barriers to reporting. We want to make sure that people feel as comfortable as possible. We always say that good news travels fast, but bad news should travel faster. We want that information as soon as possible so that we can interrupt a potential incident. Some things that you'll want to be thinking about are, do you have written policies that clearly define boundaries? And when I say clearly define boundaries, we really advocate for some specific things to say, here are some things that are appropriate. High fives, side hugs, holding hands with small children. And to balance that with things that say, these things are not okay. Piggyback rides, tickling, wrestling. Make it very clear what's out of bounds. Does your screening process assess for abuse risk? And again, we know you're looking at 15 things when you're interviewing someone for a staff position or even in a volunteer position, but this should be kind of threaded throughout and getting that behavioral profile of that individual to see if really they're appropriate to be working with youth. Do you require all staff and volunteers to complete training that's preventative, not just reactive? So again, we have the knowledge that we didn't have 25 years ago about things that we know can lead to abuse. So let's have that conversation. Do you have specific procedures for managing high-risk activities related to abuse? So your bathroom policies, your overnight activities policies, if you have lock-ins or if you have a camp, those really high-risk areas need some protocols, and I'll share with you in a bit ways to get at some ones that we've developed at Presidium. Do you have a written procedure for responding to suspicious behaviors that don't raise to the level of abuse? Again, responding to those tremors is where we're going to have that prevention opportunity. So being able to manage that well is going to serve you so well, so well. And again, in all of this, I want to keep in mind that we're not just talking about adult to youth abuse. We're talking about youth to youth abuse too, and we're trying to prevent false allegations. False allegations are quite rare, but we know that the impact of a false allegation can really be serious for a close-knit community like a church. All right, so here's the exciting part. Presidium, in our relationship with the insurance board, we are able to provide your churches with 3 products at substantial discounts. There are a lot of churches that haven't used these systems, and it's free. So I want to encourage any of you who haven't taken advantage of this to do so. The first is our Armada's Learn to Protect training system, which is a really long way of saying online training. We have an entire catalog of courses available to the congregation served by Insurance Board, and we have recommendations for curriculum, which types of courses we recommend over time for different types of staff. And really, this is getting at a lot of the material that I mentioned earlier, understanding types of offenders, understanding red flag behaviors, how to protect yourself, also understanding the dynamics of youth-to-youth abuse. So this is really, really good. There's foundational training, but there's also very specific types of training depending on types of ministry. So I really want to encourage you if you haven't taken advantage of that. The next one is called Know Your Work, and this is an online self-assessment tool that walks you through, remember, the safety equation. We have best practices under each of those 8 functions of the safety equation, and you can log into this tool and for free kind of do a self-check. It's kind of a good way to hold a mirror up to yourself to say, gosh, where are our weaknesses right now? What are our operational challenges? What are our exposures? And the best part is there are tons of resources loaded into the tool. So as I mentioned before, those high-risk activities like overnights or bathrooms or camp, we have sample protocols that you can take and make them your own based on your circumstances, but at least gives you, I would say, 80 to 90% of what you need. And so that's just a tremendous service. This is kind of a kitchen sink. You get everything in this. And then background checking services. As I mentioned, this is really important. And so we offer that service at Presidium and have negotiated a pretty substantial discount with Insurance Board denomination churches. And if you are an IB insured, if you're a member, they subsidize those up to 50%. And so there is a website that you can visit, and I believe it's on the next slide here. It's called the Safe Conduct Workbench. And Mary, at the end, if you want to circle back on this, you can tell what all's in there. But this is where you can access all the resources that Insurance Board has, including those that I just mentioned. So we want to make it as easy as possible for you to get to those. And it's just a great, great workbench, tool chest of everything that you'll need here. Okay.